John Lott is the head of the Crime Prevention Research Center. John, thank you very much for coming on. We appreciate you taking the time. I know that you are in high demand, unfortunately, when something like this happens. I posted this morning your piece about this shooting taking place at another one of these areas that you refer to as a gun-free zone. Talk to us about that.
Yeah, I appreciate you having me on, Larry. Look, these are crushing events. You and I have talked about these for a couple decades. And, Biden, the one thing I agreed with the president last night when he spoke was that we need to do something about it. And I think it's far past time to go and deal with what I consider to be reasonable regulations. And the main issue here is these killers, the successful ones, time after time, keep on going to places where they know victims aren't going to be able to go and defend themselves. Just less than a couple of weeks ago, we had this attack in Buffalo, New York. I don't know how many people have actually read the killer's manifesto, but one of the things that he talked about was his selection of what places to go and attack. And he explicitly talked about trying to find places where he was sure either no one or at least the probability that no one would have a concealed handgun permit would be very high. In New York, as in California, they're a so-called may issue state. You have to go and provide a good reason for why you should be able to go and protect yourself. And they just rarely give out permits, and particularly in urban areas. So the guy went to an urban area, plus he went to a minority area, a poor minority area. And given that permits in New York can cost $200 on up, he was pretty certain that he wouldn't run across anybody that had a concealed handgun permit to stop him there. This attack that we saw yesterday is just another one of these school shootings where they go to a place where their victims aren't going to be armed. And 30% of the schools in Texas have armed teachers or staff. Nationwide, there are 20 states, including Texas, that have armed teachers and staff. A little while ago, we did a study that looked at all the discharges of firearms on school property, any kindergarten through secondary school in the country from 2000 on up. And what we found was that there was not a single attack that occurred at any school that had teachers and staff armed. All the attacks, and they were increasing some over time, but all the attacks occurred in places where they weren't armed. Just one last point, and that is people talk about having a uniformed guard to go and guard these places. The Buffalo attacker, there was a uniformed guard there, and some schools have that. What I don't think people appreciate is how difficult the job is when you put one uniformed guard, armed guard, to stop something. Having that uniform is kind of like him wearing a neon sign that says, "Shoot me first." I mean, who do you think the attacker is going to go after? If he believes that there's only one person in the area that has a gun, if he takes that person out, he's going to have free reign to go after other people that are there. And, he has a huge tactical advantage in going after the first person there. And the thing is, if you had concealed carry permit holders, it would actually make the job of that officer much safer. Because if he goes after that officer and he reveals his position, he has to worry that somebody behind him or to the side, somebody who he doesn't know whether they're armed or not, might be able to go and stop him. But this is like the easiest thing to find out whether places are armed or, are gun-free zones or not. And yet the media keeps refusing to ever talk about these types of things. Instead, they speculate about things that they're often wrong about, how do you get the gun or what guns that were used, things that are often proven to be wrong in the long run. But the easy stuff, finding out whether it was yet another gun-free zone, 94% of the mass public shootings since 1950 have occurred in places where civilians are banned from having guns.
Now, John, regarding the fact that none of these shootings have taken place where you say the teachers and staff are armed? Do you mean are armed as in a certain percentage of them, in fact, are carrying, or armed as in the school permits them to carry? We don't know whether or not, however, a certain percentage are in fact carrying. Does that make sense?
Sure. I mean, it's clearly in terms of whether the school permits them to do it,
Mm-hmm.
but I'm pretty sure that the schools use, as far as I can tell, only kind of move to these types of policies if they have interest on the part of the teachers and staff to be able to go and do this. Look, simply having a change in signs, going from a sign that says this school is a gun-free zone to a sign that says warning, selective teachers and staff at this school are carrying concealed handguns and will use them to protect the students and other people that are on the premises. It doesn't take rocket science to kind of understand why that might make a difference in terms of whether or not an attacker goes there, because he can't be sure whether or not he's going to run into somebody who might be armed, somebody that he can't tell until it's too late for him, whether or not they're going to be able to defend themselves or not.
Now, John, you and I have talked about your documentation over the years of a number of armed civilians who've been able to stop a mass attack, break off a mass attack, or make a mass attack less deadly than it otherwise would be. Tell us about some of these instances.
Right. Well, I mean, we collect literally dozens of these cases on our website at crimeresearch.org just over the last few years. And it's amazing how these dramatic, heroic stories don't get national news attention. They may not even get more than a couple or a few local news hits on them. My guess is that the entire debate would be dramatically different if some of them did get national news coverage. And even the few that do get national news coverage, the national media seems to muck up the story and really change the meaning. But I'll give you a couple examples. Everybody knows about Parkland. Well, just a few months after that, at an elementary school not very far away from where the Parkland High School Marjorie Douglas shooting had occurred, there was an elementary school that was having a big event at a park right next to the school. And you had the students there, their parents, the teachers and staff, literally many hundreds of people that were there. And what happened was a man came up, started firing his gun there. Fortunately, there was a vendor right there who had his permitted concealed handgun, was able to shoot the attacker and seriously wound him before the attacker successfully killed or wounded anybody. But you would think you'd just have a school shooting right near Parkland. You would think this would be major news, but you will search in vain to find any national news stories on that. I'll give you another case. Take the Pulse nightclub shooting. For many years, that was by far the worst mass public shooting in the United States, just outside of Orlando, Florida. Well, a week later, there was an attack at another nightclub in South Carolina. 3 people were shot. The attacker was shooting at a 4th person when a concealed carry permit holder pulled out his gun and seriously wounded the attacker. He had still had over 120 rounds of ammunition on him. One can only imagine the type of news coverage it would have gotten if the law-abiding civilian with a concealed handgun hadn't stopped it. But here's the interesting thing. Florida is one of 10 states that banned people carrying permitted concealed handguns in establishments that got more than 50% of their revenue from serving alcohol. South Carolina was one of the 40 states that allowed it. So fortunately, the attack was stopped in Florida. But, I can give you examples where they do give some national news coverage, but they completely botch the story. Everybody remembers the synagogue shooting in Pittsburgh. Just a few days after that, there was an attack at a Kroger grocery store in Louisville, Kentucky. A racist had gone into the grocery store and was shooting blacks. And what got the attention of some of the news media, like Meet the Press, Chuck Todd, was a quote where the murderer reportedly told a customer, "Whites don't shoot whites." And the interpretation of that was, well, since the murderer and the customer were both whites, the customer didn't have anything to worry about. At the time, I was still able to text back and forth with Chuck Todd. He hadn't blocked me until this. And what happened was I texted Chuck. I said, Chuck, I just watched this on your show, and I think you missed part of the quote. Here are some local media that have the full quote that the murderer said. And what the murderer's full quote was, please don't shoot me. Whites don't shoot whites. So rather than the murderer trying to assure the customer that the customer was safe, the murderer was actually pleading with the customer, who had a permanently concealed handgun, and was pointing the gun at the murderer and begging the customer not to shoot him.
Wow.
Well, they exchanged fire. The murderer was seriously wounded. He got into his car, drove about a mile down the road when he passed out, and that's when police were able to go and arrest him. But Chuck Todd and other news media that I reached out to at that time who were covering the story never corrected it.
John, I remember a story like that some years ago. There was a shooting at a law school in Grundy, Virginia, where the bad guy shot a dean, shot a teacher, and shot a student. And there were, I believe, one, if not two, off-duty officers ran out to their car, got their firearms, went back in, pointed the firearms at the shooter, at which time the shooter stopped and people tackled him. Right. Newspaper after newspaper after newspaper referred to the spree as having been halted because courageous people tackled him, omitting the part about the firearms being pointed at the bad guy, which caused the bad guy to stop shooting. And one of the sheriffs said, dozens of newspapers, including newspapers like the Washington Post, interviewed me. I told them exactly what happened, yet they misreported the story.
Right. I was actually on that radio show with you when you had one of they had kind of left their jobs as deputy sheriffs. Right. They were in law school, I think like the second year of law school. And, and you're right. One of them was shocked. He had talked to lots and lots of media. And of course, he was curious what people were saying. And for some reason, report after report left out that part of the story. I later decided to call up after we did the radio show with you. I started calling up some of the media. There was a woman named Maria Glad, who was the reporter at the Washington Post that you're referring to. And so I called her up and I said, why did you leave this out of the story here? It seems kind of important for it. And she said it was basically space constraints, that she only had 800 words or so, and that she simply didn't have enough space to go into the fact that the students had pointed their guns at the attacker. And I suppose my response was, look, most people would view this as pretty unusual that, and I'm sure the reporter did, that these students had used their guns to stop this other student. And, wouldn't what was perceived of as an unusual story be considered more newsworthy? But, besides that, I'm not sure I want to really give the impression to somebody that, you simply run across a yard and then tackle somebody with a gun. You talk about bringing a knife to a gunfight, not bringing any weapon to a gunfight doesn't seem particularly smart to make people think that that's a successful way of handling these things. But in fact, my book, The Bias Against Guns, I go through the different interviews that I had with the different reporters. It was quite startling.
John, we only have a minute left. There was an article this morning, New York Times, that mentioned 35 people are murdered every day with a firearm. It said nothing whatsoever about how many people are to defend themselves, and a certain percentage of them say, but for the firearm, they would have been dead or suffered serious bodily injury. Do we have an accurate number of how many Americans are alive every year as opposed to those who are dead illegally because of firearms?
We don't have a perfect number. We have to go and use surveys. There's a lot of surveys that are done. You kind of enough surveys, hopefully you get a rough idea about what's going on. But look, The media has a huge impact on people's perceptions about the costs and benefits of guns. Last year, in August last year, I looked through like the first 9 months of the year for the news coverage in the 5 largest newspapers: the New York Times that you mentioned, the LA Times, the Washington Post, USA Today, and the Wall Street Journal. Between them, they had something like 2,600 stories about gun crimes that resulted in either murder or serious injury from a gunshot. By contrast, those 5 newspapers had a total of 10 defensive gun use stories, and and they overwhelmingly had, of those 10, had cases where something went wrong. Either the defensive gun use person shot the wrong person, or the gun was taken away from them and used. So, and somebody could be considered well-read, that they keep up on the news, and they would think, look, there are lots of gun crimes. Virtually never are guns used to go and stop crimes. And the few times that they are, something goes wrong. And just, I know I'm running out of time, but just quickly, to give you an idea, we went through, looked at all the news stories we could find in the country last year. Most news stories on defensive gun uses involve cases where the attacker's been killed. The next most common are injuries. Only about 4% of defensive gun uses that are mentioned in the media involve simple brandishing. And yet we know probably about 95% of defensive gun uses involve simple brandishing. Now, you can explain that without referencing media bias. If you're an editor and you have 2 stories, in one case there's a dead body on the ground, in another case a woman's brandished a gun, the would-be attackers run away, no shots are fired, no dead body on the ground, no crime actually committed, it's not a big mystery which one you would pick. I think most of us would pick the dead body on the ground. Now, that may be fine in terms of what's newsworthy or what gets clicks, but in terms of policy, in terms of what protects people and saves lives, we care about both cases that are there, even the non-newsworthy ones. And unfortunately, the media doesn't give people good representation. If you take surveys of gun crimes and you take surveys on defensive gun uses, it looks like people are using guns defensively to stop crime about 4 to 5 times more frequently than guns are used to commit crime.
John Lott, crimeresearch.org. John, as always, thank you so much for taking the time.
Thank you.
Hope you enjoyed the show. I'm Larry Elder, and this has been the Larry Elder Show for Epoch Times. See you tomorrow.